Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. Community Bookstore will be celebrating 50 years in business this fall, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled tonight to welcome Tom McCarthy to celebrate his new novel, The Making of Incarnation, in conversation with Hal Foster. Now to some housekeeping, we've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight's event is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise, and we'll try to solve them quickly. We've scheduled a whole host of fall programming for you, so head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is on Tuesday, November 16th. We're thrilled to welcome Rachel Kushner and translator Isabel Fargo Cole for a discussion of Wolfgang Hilbig's masterpiece, The Interim, out now from Two Lines Press. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. Now, a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Tom McCarthy is a novelist whose work has been translated into more than 20 languages and adapted for cinema, theater, and radio. His first novel, Remainder, won the 2008 Believer Book Award. His third, C, was a 2010 Booker Prize finalist, as was his fourth, Satin Island, in 2015. McCarthy is also author of the study Tintin and the Secret of Literature and of the essay collection Typewriters, Bombs, Jellyfish. He contributes regularly to publications such as the New York Times, the London Review of Books, Harper's, and Art Forum. In 2013, he was awarded the inaugural Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. He lives in Berlin. Hal Foster is the author of numerous books, including, most recently, What Comes After Farce, Art and Criticism at a Time of Debacle, was 2020 from Verso Books, and Brutal Aesthetics from Princeton University Press, 2020 as well. His 2018 Mellon Lectures at the Brutal Aesthetics, was his 2018 Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in Washington. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he teaches at Princeton University, co-edits the journal October, and contributes regularly to the London Review of Books and Art Forum. So now, without any further ado, Tom, Hal, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Noah, and welcome everyone. Tom, first of all, just congratulations on the book. It's a wonder, and it's so much fun to read, as you know, just conceptually, but just as a narrative. It's like a detective story, detective history that leads right to the heart of the present. So again, congratulations. We thought we might begin with a reading from you, so take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your kind words about the book. Thank you very much. I know it's a busy time of year for you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you to Community Bookstore and to Gabriella Brooks at Knopf. Yeah, I'll just read a little bit from the Prolegomenon, the kind of overture, which takes place in the Versuchsanstalt für Wasserbau und Schiffbau, the Research Institute for Hydraulic Engineering and Shipbuilding here in Berlin, because I think it really kind of gives the flavor of the whole book. Here in the Seegangsbecken, the sea-keeping basin or wave generator, Neptune's wrath is about to be unleashed on a platform supply vessel, an anchor handling tug, and 2 oil rigs. Resident technician Ada Götschek Dip Ing, VWS's keeper of the sea, stands at the basin's absorption end, moving his thumb and fingers around a MacBook's glide pad, scaling metrics, modifying ratios, adjusting up or down wave height and stroke length, characteristic and gravitational velocities. When the profile on his screen, the rhythm of its curves and intervals aligns with that of today's target values, Götschek's hand breaks contact with the laptop, hovers an inch or two above its keyboard while his eyes cross-check the graphic contours one last time, then falls decisively back down on the space bar. More than 100 meters away at the basin's far end, the wave generation mechanism groans. Drive arms, pulleys, and linkage arms, drive pegs, flange bearings, and connecting rods stir, clasp, and thrust, shunting a slanted flap repeatedly against the water's bulk. And then it comes down the long, narrow stretch. Peak, doubling the ceiling's intermittent strip lights one after the other, raising each inverted spectral light line up towards its source before the trough swallows the reflection once more in its darkened vortex, the first wave. It's followed by another and another and another, soaking the green tiles along the basin's sides, redrawing the same high water mark over and over with complete precision. Now the waves are among the models, tossing and convulsing them, sending them veering laterally and vertically, longitudinally, transversely, and every which way in between, down paths that seem quite random, but in fact are not at all. That's the whole point. Cameras at the basin's sides are tracking and translating every heave and surge and sway, identifying within the furious tangle of the lines some kind of pattern to be viewed both retro and prospectively, its fuzz transmuted into clean parameters that once modeled can be not only scaled back up for the benefit of future offshore installation planners, but also traversing their own vectors of circulation and displacement, transferred and extrapolated and fed into who knows what. Over the next 16 months, today's worked through data will be brought to bear on fields as variant as infrasonics and seismocardiography, the study of germ convection around airline cabins, and the spread of rumor over social networks. Things are connected to other things, which are connected to other things. Yesterday, 103 Asian miners died in a methane explosion. A small South American state underwent a coup. A large pod of whales beached itself off Western Europe's coastline. The pages of Gottschalk's newspaper, lying open on a stool beside a half-drunk coffee cup, rustle as he climbs a nearby stepladder, borne upwards in his slipstream. From on high, the technician watches the boats lurching and bobbing drunkenly amidst the swells and currents, hurtling past the battered reefs of the oil platform's legs and anchors. The elevation calms him. He's above the struggle, uninvolved. Visions of the Bosporus drift across his mind's back reaches, morphing through various formations, less a place glimpsed from car windows and mosque terraces on holidays, extended family visits, than a vague ancestral memory, an idea. The wave generation mechanism groans. The flap shunts on to the same rhythm. The anchor handling tug, its prow of hardened paraffin, has got itself wedged in one of the oil rig's leg struts. Computer modeling won't show you everything. Sometimes you have to actually do it, make a little world, get down amidst dumb objects and their messiness. From the basin's exterior, where it rests on J-hooks beside coils of hosing, wiring, torn canvas and string, Gottschalk lifts a pike pole and leans in over the edge, trying to prise the vessel free. His right foot, raised behind him for stability, nudges the stool, coffee slops out, glossing the news pages. On a work table beside the stool are an isopropanol spray can, a CD-ROM, a roll of toilet paper, an ice lolly stick, a crumpled plastic glove of the type used for washing up, weights, floats, a fire extinguisher, an off-cut block of wood, a fold-out ruler, a handheld torch, a tote bag, an external hard drive, a red marker pen, a plastic cup with small screws in it, a blue case of cross-point screwdrivers, a grease tin, and a scrunched up piece of tissue, paper, stained with a red substance. Further back, against the wall, models superfluous to today's scenario are stacked. A submarine, an ICE train, 15 wind turbines, a life-sized emperor penguin, and the city of Mumbai. Gertchek's pike pole, finding its sweet spot on the tug's hull, prods it loose. The tug capsizes momentarily, spins on its side through a full clockwise circle and a third of an anti-clockwise one, then righting itself, glides round the lead struts to find open water. The flap shunts, the wave generation mechanism groans. So,
Brilliant.
yeah, modeling.
Modeling. Before we get on to the various stories, I just want to rest with this passage for a moment. On the one hand, you have data creation through this wave machine. You say this data will be brought to bear on various fields. Things are connected to other things, which are connected to other things. And these patterns that are generated that are immaterial. But then there's the resistance of the object world. You say computer modeling won't show you everything. Sometimes you actually have to do it, make a little world get down amidst dumb objects and their messiness. And throughout the book, it seems to me that there's this extraordinary tension between the production of data that nonetheless encounters its own resistance. I mean, there's the sheer labor of its production, but then it confronts matter and the accidents of matter, even the accidents of media. And you dwell on glitches and artifacts and this transfer between material and the informational. So can you talk about that theme, that problem as it runs through the book?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. You know, so the book is very much taking place amidst the world of motion capture and all the various applications for which it's used, ranging from sports to medicine to war to entertainment, and so on. Yeah, bodies. I mean, it's all about bodies in motion, and the task is that the early motion capture devices were called motion translators. I like this idea. You know, you have a body like a gymnast spinning around a pommel horse, and the task is to translate. It's a linguistic exercise to translate that matter into information. And there's always a kind of resistance, as you say, of the matter itself, some kind of recalcitrance. So there's a scene, I guess, I mean, it plays out throughout the book where they're making this big sci-fi movie, which is basically a kind of Star Wars version of the Tristan and Isolde myth. And they've plotted this perfect sex scene in zero gravity, and they've used these incredibly expensive, complex algorithms to plot exactly the way the light from the planet outside the spaceship bounces around and around the bodies. And it's all going to be absolutely brilliantly balletic. But then as soon as they put the actual bodies in there, it goes all wrong, because the bodies just, you know, even if they're almost right, they're not quite right, and they flab and sag, and they're kind of disgusting, and the skin is, you know, like chicken skin. It's and if anyone's read Kleist's famous essay on the marionette theatre, they'll recognize quite a few words and strings of words in that passage. I mean, I deliberately kind of lifted, because he writes so brilliantly about exactly this, how human bodies aren't as good as marionettes' bodies because they don't follow logarithms, which is his old-fashioned word for algorithm. They don't do it right. And I love this idea of the physical itself as a form of imperfection, and for that very reason, a form of resistance to total capture and to total translation.
Right, I want to ask you later about what kind of recalcitrance or resistance is there in the physical or in the bodily. I mean, is there for me, it's a dread word, but what kind of agency is there? But first, tell us more about this, the genealogy that's sketched in the book. Not sketched, it's made very, very vivid from early experiments in time motion studies, Murray, but also the scientific management of labor in Taylor and the Gilbreths. I mean, Lillian Gilbreth is really one of the heroes.
Yeah, she's kind of the hero of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us more about the genealogy from these early experiments, which maybe they were never benign, but are certainly more benign than our experience of mocap now.
Well, you're right. They were and they weren't. Well, they weren't. I mean, so Murray, who I know you've written about, and he's a contemporary of the much better known Muybridge, but Muybridge was a bit of a charlatan, a bit of a showman. Murray was the serious guy, the serious scientist, and he was, he produced these gorgeous images of birds in flight and athletes in the 1880s and 90s, and this kind of slow delay photography. But he was hired by the French government in the wake of their defeat to Prussia in that 1870 war. There was a sense that there was a bit of soul searching in France, and it was decided that whereas the Prussian youth were all kind of regimented and militarized, and if they weren't soldiers, they were athletes and boxers, whereas the French ones were just sitting around, smoking hashish and drinking absinthe and reading poetry or writing poetry, even worse. And so Murray was hired, and he was given this title, the Professor of Organized Bodies. It's like, it could have been something, a phrase out of Deleuze, but he was given this title in 1880 something, and he started doing these studies of, in fact, two of the first things he studied were a bayonet thrust and a signature. So right from the off, writing and killing, which were kind of almost identical, this kind of motion over a surface and inscription across space. And his work, I mean, it was aesthetically gorgeous. It had this huge effect on painters and through the futurists and the post-impressionists and Duchamp, but he always said, I'm not an artist, even when they held him as one. So I think, so by the time you come to Lillian Gilbreth, which is about 40 years later, she does a kind of next generation or 3 generations down the line application of Mary's techniques by putting a light ring on the finger of a seamstress or a soap packer on an assembly line, as she does the same repetitive movement 100 to 1,000 times a day. And by filming it by slow photographing it in stereoscope, you can get a 3-dimensional model of the motion, which she would then sculpt. So it was very much about, capitalism and the world of increased profits. But she's this fascinating figure. She went to school with Isadora Duncan and Gertrude Stein. So, and she studied.
And Jack London, you say too.
Well, Jack London, yeah, but he's the kind of, I feel like he was looking backwards. He spent his life stumbling drunk around these woods looking for some kind of lost 18th century. And these 3 women, meanwhile, just stepped out and kind of invented the 20th. I mean, they were actually much more interesting.
Sure, okay.
And but she studied literature. She was in love with Dante all her life, which is again all about geometries and la diritta via, the straight way. Her catchphrase was, every action has its perfect way. It was
the one best way, I think.
The one best way. I mean, she was a Platonist, basically. So there was a huge, and although she was a lifelong Republican, Lenin loved her, and the Soviets, there was this whole Soviet Taylorist kind of movement. It was seen that the type of technique she was opening up was seen as potentially very emancipatory. This idea that
and that's folded into the novel too, the way that these studies cut across periods and regimes. I mean, that's part of your narrative.
Sure. I mean, I think it can go both ways. Of course, we could think of many, many ways in which it's pretty bad. The way the afterlife of her work is played out, and we're living with the consequences of that. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of real kind of fascinating dimensions to it.
Well, let me push you on that point, because clearly my word benign was the wrong one, but certainly Lillian believed that her studies would make the lives of women, I don't know, more efficient. Maybe that's simply to discipline them. But I get that the afterlife is disciplinary. But for you, is this genealogy of time motion studies to motion capture, is it strictly disciplinary? In other words, is there no science that does not turn into technology, that does not turn into research and development in your world? I mean, in other novels, that seems to be the trajectory. And here again, I suppose, the question is there no difference within or outside to this order? Or, is it a version of just left pessimism? Usually we associate the right with pessimistic attitude to the human being, the fallen human. But I wonder if, just to be provocative, if I can accuse you of left pessimism when it comes to this technological trajectory that you trace. I mean, I totally agree with you, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I think there's no outside. There's no outside to the regime of capture. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. There are spaces within. There are glitches. There are gaps. There are delays. There are intervals, and these are spaces where different types of where power can operate differently, where different types of possibilities open up.
Can you talk about those specifically? Because I mean, just those terms that you offered us, interval, glitch. I mean, you're a huge fan of Mallarmé, and the question of the pause, the caesura, the interval is very important to you. But then you're also very interested in media glitches and media artifacts. Can you talk about what kinds of possibilities these two very different kinds of openings do permit?
Sure. I mean, I guess artifacts, glitches, it's a wonderful word, by the way, artifact. I mean, it's like the work of art, it's in my last novel, Saturninum, which dealt with anthropology. This is what tribal objects are called, artifacts, that the kind of post-imperial regime of the anthropologist has to, again, translate into information, and they resist this. And in the digital realm, it's also in a very colonial context. So typically, you have a drone over the desert in Afghanistan, a military drone, translating the whole landscape and using the same algorithms that are derived from motion capture research into sport and medicine and all the other things we're talking about, to analyze movements on the ground and decide whether these are insurgent links and therefore whether to send down a strike. So it's very sinister, but glitches are the very thing that resist that. They're the kind of the ghost in the machine, the kickback. But that would be in a kind of an inhuman form of resistance. It's not the it's not the human resistance to occupation or to empire doing that. It's the actual interface of the technology of translation itself. It kind of arises from within, like a bug. But yeah, I mean, human. You asked about agency, and I guess this book kind of totally rejects one kind of heroic, old-fashioned revolutionary version of agency. I mean, there's a scene where this woman is looking at a forensic render of a room in which a state assassination has taken place, and the geometry is so absolutely perfect that she thinks, how could this room have ever been planned for anything else other than this one event? It's the kind of Oedipus moment, wherever he goes within those geometries of intersecting lines, he's always going to end up at that point at which the murder happens. He has and whatever he does to avoid it, it's just going to lead him even more to that point. There's no autonomy outside of that grid. But then, I don't know, I think just in the delay itself and in the you know, contemplation, when a regime of capture turns into a regime of kind of contemplation, you're just watching a gymnast spin around and around and around a pommel horse, and everything is suspended. And I found this amazing. I was reading quite a lot of Agamben. He writes just beautifully about this, as that, you know, the body in labor is the site of a process playing out. But he says in the body in labor, even the most unfree body, even in the body of the slave, the Greek slave or Roman slave, there is an excess of energy over usefulness. And this, he calls this love. He calls this, you know, he calls it love. And he says, and he talks about the temporality of contemplation when delay is somehow built into the moment, and the moment then is turned back to itself, not as something useful, but as this as this form of pure contemplation. He says this is got the quote here. I thought you might ask me this. He writes, if thought, the arts, poetry, and human practices generally have any interest, it is because they bring about an archaeological idling of the machine and the works of life, language, economy, and society in order to carry them back to the anthropocentric event, in order that in them the becoming human of the human being will never be achieved once and for all, will never cease to happen. And he says, politics names the place of this event in whatever field, in whatever sphere it is produced. I mean, that's brilliant. That's not pessimistic. I think that's an affirmation of the possibility of politics, but without all this now right-wing crap about freedom and sovereignty and all that stuff that you only hear now from the mouths of Brexiters and anti-vaxxers anyway. Right. Screw that stuff.
It is a beautiful quote. I wish I understood it as fully as you. But
I'm not saying I understand it, I just love it.
But you did bring up the idea, in part through Agamben, but also through your example of the gymnast, of the perfect movement. And one of the objects that drives the book is the search for one of the boxes of Lillian Gilbreth, one of her studies, and kept in many, many boxes. It's box 808. I don't think this is to give away the plot, but there's one box that cannot be found. And at times you hint that it might somehow disclose or enclose an example of perfect movement. Is that right? I mean, it's not, you know, it's not like, Tom, what's in the box? What's in the box? But the reader does want to know what the hell is in the box.
Sure. Well, I mean, it started as a kind of narrative, almost like a kind of challenge to myself, like, you know, a MacGuffin. Can I build a book around a MacGuffin? You know, like the Maltese Falcon and the Lost Ark. What's in the box? Everyone wants it. It's like Hitchcock says, it doesn't matter what's in the box. It's just that everyone wants it. But then, so Lillian Gilbreth made all these boxes with sculpted to-scale motions of thousands of hundreds of different types of motion. Often of assembly workers, but often usually of assembly line workers, so hand motions, the idea being that they could be studied and repeated. So there were these kind of captured moments of time, really, time and motion. She called it embodied data. And where I've taken the kind of the actual biography further is I've kind of invented a numbering system and a box that's missing, that somehow maybe, as you say, has a perfect, absolutely perfect motion. And all these different interest groups, of course, want it, you know, ranging from the military to various people who want to copyright it. And, you know, this is the kind of what holds the whole constellation of the book's interest groups, and it's the kind of point of focus. And without giving too much away, I mean, that there is something inside it, and it is emotion. And it's the best way to describe it is after Duchamp as a delay in glass. Right? I mean, it's a moment of delay in which something is happening, just turning back on itself endlessly, and it was kind of experienced by one person who modeled it via a window, which caused it to glitch because it was an old window, a loopy window. But then he describes it to Lillian Gilbreth, back in the 1960s when she's coming to the end of her life. And then other people find the correspondence and have their own interpretations. So it's not even like about one person's, in Proust, it's about one person's moment of experience, eating the Madeleine or whatever, or watching the Duchess of Guermantes take out her umbrella. But with this, it's more kind of, it's in the relays and delays between all these different people. It's more of a kind of collective endeavor or set of projections and elisions and slides between different points.
Maybe you can tell us more about these different characters and these different stories, because it does seem to me that, for example, in Remainder, there's a traumatic event, but it pertains to one individual. Here, the event seems to skid across the country and across the century and across countries, and it involves many different people. It shows up in many different assemblages, as you would put it. So can you just tell us a little bit more about how those people appear and in what settings and what assemblages?
Sure. I mean, yeah, in Remainder, I mean, it's very simple. This guy just gets obsessed with a set of movements, and because he has lots of money at his disposal, just hires all these people to reenact them in a fixed environment and carries on doing that and modulating them until everyone's dead. And in that case, it's a kind of psychotic art project of a kind of poet manqué, not quite art project. But with this book, I guess, doing the research for this book, and especially stumbling across Lillian Gilbreth and visiting these contemporary motion study places and seeing the kind of applications of it and thinking about, the world we live in of Google and Uber and everything else, I realized that psychotic art project from Remainder is basically the entire driving logic of late capitalism, and early and middle capitalism too. It's the logic of the assembly line and general the algorithmic data control and the general interpretation and capturing and governance of general motion on a planetary scale. And yeah, it plays out across a long time, I guess. In this book, it just in terms of the plot, there's this box that was made sometime in the 60s that everyone's after, based on research done in the 1880s, which itself, is based on an understanding of, it goes back to the Greeks and all kinds of stuff. But sorry, to actually answer your question, yeah, there's different groups after it. So, we spend quite a lot of time with a motion capture company, and we spend quite a lot of time on a film set that this company works for. We visit the military people that this company work for. I guess visiting these places, what was really interesting from a kind of political or even ethical or moral, to use an old-fashioned word, kind of point of view, was that these guys, who are basically artisans, that it's about visual culture. Lots of them have backgrounds in art and visual culture, and it's about drawing things. On the Monday, they might be in a hospital gates lab helping map the muscular and skeletal systems of a child with with muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis. On Tuesday, they're working with a leftist NGO to prove that a killing in Guatemala was actually a state assassination. On Wednesday, they're working with the military, helping them better conduct straight assassinations. On Thursday, they were working for Liverpool football team, helping them, interpret algorithms of movement within a football game. And on Friday, they're making some kind of blockbuster movie. And it's the same hardened software, and it's the same computational matrices that do all of these things. So I guess, what interests me is not in some kind of geeky way, the actual tech. It's a way this opens a window onto an older question about like what's the relation of the artisan to power. How do they navigate this? What are the ethical responsibilities?
But the tech is not neutral. It's just not a matter of different uses, good, bad. The tech is problematic intrinsically for you, no?
Yes, but it can cure kids of,
right,
of awful diseases, and it can bring about justice. I mean, it can, if it brings people to account for a state killing, that's a good thing. I mean, this is, I was thinking a lot about forensic architecture, right, whose work I know you've written about too, and I was visiting them. In fact, they were very generous in helping open some of these kind of scenarios to me, and what they do is fantastic, and would be unthinkable without the very same software that the military are using to kill people. So it's, I don't know. I mean, I'm not, of course, software is not neutral.
Okay, I think that's actually very important to highlight in the book. I mean, I love Staten Island, but in part because it was so cynical that there was an anthropologist embedded in a corporation to assist with its development. I mean, it's brilliant. But in what you just said about the different applications and implications of these media, it does open up other possibilities. It's not just one awful military post-industrial digital entertainment complex in the book.
No, and I think, I mean, it's older than that. It's ultimately a kind of an aesthetic problem. I mean, if aesthetics just means like what we can sense and how we can sense this is aesthetics par excellence. Like, what is a ancient Greek amphora painter doing when they paint a discus thrower in? I mean, it's kind of the same. It's just basically the problem of description. How do you translate a body into writing, into some kind of mark across a surface? It's the problem of writing, and another kind of strand that runs through this book is the history of copyright, which again comes back to writing, to the edict of Queen Anne that gives the author the ownership of the content of their book rather than the printer. And which is in 1710 or something, but this is what lies behind loads of stuff in the American Constitution and copywriting of music. And then it gets, it's hugely racialized, this history as well. It tends to skew towards white people owning black bodies or owning the labor of black bodies and so on. And it cuts through music and entertainment. But it all comes down to, a problem of description, of scriptural, writing, scriptural culture.
So do you find in writing real possibility? Maybe this gets us back to your interest in the Mallarmeian set of concerns with écriture, but also intervals. Is that agency is not the right word, but is there a power against power somehow inscribed in writing?
Yeah, I think there is, because I mean, one question this book, I try and ask several times in different guises in this book is, I mean, everything's a machine, the water tank's a machine, the wind tunnel's a machine, the camera's a machine, everything is a translation machine. And then occasionally, I mean, there's one bit in the wind tunnel when the narrator or the narrative voice or whatever says, what machine could render the following information? And it goes on to the history of, flooding in Holland and the the tulip stock market crash of the 1800s and so on. And there's all these personal histories floating around the wind tunnel and the desires of the technicians and so on. And I guess, you know, the machine, the only machine capable of rendering all of this isn't, I mean, would it's a rhetorical question. I guess it's like the book itself. I mean, or the work of art would be the only machinic assemblage capable of constellating all this shit, right? Bringing it into focus, and that's an aesthetic, obviously an aesthetic kind of event, but it's also, as I think that Agamben quote suggested, well, stated, it's political. It opens up a set of political possibilities. It doesn't translate into a kind of practical form of resistance or even polemical kind of strategy in the real world, but I think something fantastic. I really believe in like the work of art as a machine for opening up, for bringing into formation and making visible and speaking, albeit elliptically and frustratingly and so on, you know, these possibilities. Does that make any sense? It
does, and it's actually a beautifully affirmative statement. But let me ask you a question in another direction, and here I will ventriloquize our friend Simon Critchley, who wrote a terrific afterword to Men in Space. And one thing he says there, Simon does, is McCarthy's books are obsessed with cryptograms and the decoding of secret messages. And I think that's true in this book. I mentioned to you before we came on that, you know, the search for box 808 reminded me of the crying of lot 49.
Sure, yeah.
And you mentioned Pynchon in your writings and in your terrific book of essays, Typewriters, Bombs and Jellyfish, but you stick more with Mallarmé and Joyce and Kafka. But it does seem to me as if your writing has, especially in this book, a Pynchonian cast. It's edgy and fluid at once, the prose. There's, you know, great invention, delirious knowledge, but also a semi-paranoid search for patterns and the glitches in patterns, the artifacts in patterns. And there's a way in which, you know, one of the main characters, Mark Phocan, reminded me of Slothrop in Gravity's Rainbow. But like Pynchon, you seem to be fascinated by what repels you. Or is this all, does this miss the point? You don't want to be affined with the kind of Pynchonian critical paranoid method.
I mean, I think Pynchon's a very important writer and is someone whom I admire, you know, a lot. But so is Mary Shelley and Ingeborg Bachmann. You know, I mean, Gaddis and Lawrence Stern and George Eliot and a whole bunch of other people, you know, we could mention. I mean, I suppose, you know, I was reading quite a lot of Norbert Wiener, who's a beautiful writer. I mean, it's theology, it's poetry, it's all about, but I guess, you know, a novel like Crying of Lot 49 very much comes out of a reading of Wiener too.
And Wiener appears in your novel.
Sure, yeah, no, he's kind of a character, same with Gilbreth. I mean, but I'd never actually read his work directly. I would recommend it to anyone listening. It's incredibly beautiful writing, and it's more about Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, or as much about that and Manichaeanism as it is about you know, servo mechanism and feedback loops in, you know, aircraft shooting down machinery and so on, although it is about that too. Sure, but I mean, Sassen Island, it is very much paranoid critical technique. So this is Dali's idea that you can just throw a bunch of stuff together and then constellate it and you produce, you know, new meaning. It's the kind of surrealist collaging of objects and generation of ideas. And what interested me with Staten Island was that kind of avant-garde logic from the early 20th century has now become the kind of logic of the corporate think tank, and it's been totally recuperated. And that's kind of interesting. But with this book, it's not so much about interpretation. I think it's more about, I mean, of course, that's part of it, the translation of bodies into data, but it's also just very much about rhythm and time. I mean, Proust was much more important for me with this book than Pynchon. And, you know, I mean, so much of the research is just about flow. So, I mean, you know, that bit I was reading about the water tank, there's an early bit in Combray where he's just watching these kids, they're fishing, and they've put in the middle of this flowing river, they've put these glass jars that haven't got any fishing in them. They're just catching bits of river inside the river. They're arresting a bit of river within the flow of river to show the riverness of the river. And the whole book's kind of that. It's just about rhythm and flow. And then, you know, when he's describing Albertine, he says, to think of another person, you have to get snapshots of them at different bits in time and then draw the lines from one to another. I mean, this could be an exact description of what a motion capture workshop does with this gymnast, or with the kid with walking up and down. It's exactly that. You know, Merret called his technique chronostylography. I mean, the writing of time. It's almost exactly. In fact, Proust was going to call his book the Intermittencies of the Heart, which is an awful title. But you know, one of Mary's first devices was called a sphygmograph. It was a pulse writer. It literally wrote. You know, it took your pulse and wrote on a piece of blackened glass the intermittencies of the heart. Sorry, this is a very roundabout way of saying I think this is much more about rhythm. It's about, you know, at the heart of it is a not interpreted set of ballet choreographies of temporality, and that don't really need to be translated. They're just kind of beautiful.
And the corporation that's at the heart of the novel is called Parthenay, right? And that's
Pantare from Heraclitus. Everything flows. That famous line about you can't step in the same river twice. Pantare, everything's in motion. Yeah.
You know, I have so many more questions for you, but we're towards the end of the hour, and we have a few questions from the audience. But I'll get those questions to you somehow. There's actually one that picks up on your insistence on writing. In a lot of ways, it seems this is a novel about other media. Do you think fiction for writing generally, or writing generally, does something that photography or film, for example, can't do? Did you consider other media for this project? Yeah,
that's a good question. I mean, to some extent, I'm kind of a fundamentalist. I just think everything is writing. I mean, if it's about making a mark on a surface, which is what photography is, then that's writing, right? If it's, I mean, psychoanalysis is again about, I mean, look at all of Freud's models for the psyche. They're all about writing machines and surfaces that get scratched on. And it's all writing, marks in space, and the reading of marks. And but then again, you know, no, I couldn't have done this in another medium, and I can't imagine. I mean, of course, like all books, this book is out with Netflix, but it's not. I don't think they might make Incarnation, but they wouldn't make the making of. I can't quite.
The prequel. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. I can't quite imagine. You know, there's something very specific to the. I mean, again, this. You know, the mission.
No, to write a book that cannot be turned into a movie at this moment is an achievement in its own right, I think.
Thank you.
Not to be too medium specific about
it many times.
here's a question that I had, so I want to ask it. It's a great question. Do you think the terms of Zadie Smith's two paths for the novel, it's a text from, I think, 2008, the opposition McCarthyian avant-gardism versus Franzenheit, Kleinberger, the kite. I think actually the other straw person there was Joseph O'Neill, his novel Netherland. Do you think that this two paths argument made sense then or now? You think this binary needs to be reframed also in light of your new writings as an attitude to literature's role, either as a pillar of a kind of an, in fact, traditional and not so avant-garde understanding of public intellectual life, against what Jeff Williams calls the new modesty, the supplanting of explanation by description, interpretation by data in literary autofiction and related novels of affective description. The way you said about rhythm derails this. I think there's a question there, a very good question there, but have at it.
Okay, yeah, right. No, I read that essay. I think it's a good essay in as much as it gives a clear framework for thinking about stuff and debating it and disagreeing. And I disagree. I disagree with the way she sets up an opposition between, as I recall, on the one hand, there was kind of realism, which is realistic, and avant-garde writing, which is not realistic. And that just doesn't work for me, because realism isn't realistic at all. It's a literary convention. I mean, Kenny Goldsmith pointed out recently that a Gertrude Stein prose poem is actually a much more realistic description of what it's like walking down the street in New York, or a passage by William Burroughs or something, than a kind of realist description. We don't walk down the street going, as I walk down the street, I contemplate that life isn't like that. It's a cut up, it's a, so, and the big 19th century, really, your Flauberts and your Balzacs, they didn't believe it. They knew it was all fake. I mean, they delighted in just undermining the whole edifice, even as they were building it. So that's not really the distinction I'd make. I mean, I think maybe this distinction to be made is between, on the one hand, a kind of a type of literature or art in general, or thinking in general, that would place the individual, the authentic, uncritical, unquestioned individual who has authentic emotions and experiences and is, expresses them, as that would place that as the kind of unquestioned metric and measure of experience and existence on the one hand, versus on the other hand, a kind of a practice that would begin by throwing all that completely into question and recognizing that we are irremediably mediated and we are embedded in systems that precede us and exceed us, and technologies and histories and stuff, and in that respect, I don't see a fundamental difference between what someone like I am trying to do and what someone like you is trying to do, or many other, or visual artists. My late friend, and I think yours too, Mark Cousins, who was a wonderful professor at the Architectural Association, his preferred term was study. He called study just the pursuing of thinking and bringing things into relation with other things, not in order to produce the answers to these questions, but in order to study more as a pleasurable, but also a necessary activity. And there are some things that need to be brought into relation critically, like, for example, the relationship between, technologies and power and aesthetics. I mean, all the stuff we're talking about. And I think, the writing of someone like Hito Steyl, or the visual art of Trevor Paglen or Omer Fast, or I don't know, many people, or the critical writing of someone like you. I mean, all kinds of.
Well, you begin with that beautiful set piece that you read that seemed to be inspired in part by Haroon Farooqi, and you mentioned forensic architecture and that the use of other media, of just things. You talk in your essay book jellyfish as media. That's your affinity with not only with theorists but artists. It warms me because another generation just did not have it, and you're part of a cohort that's committed to art and informed about art, and as well as philosophy and theory. We just have time for a couple more questions, and they're good ones.
I'd say after Mark Cousins, we're informed by study. We're committed to study.
Right.
And the form that study takes can vary. This stuff that is urgent to think about. And sorry.
I mean, that's the study studio, the practice of the artist and the practice of the writer, the philosopher. Here's a question from Andrew Mitchell. Heidegger distinguishes epochs in the history of technology, with modern technology operating through objectification and contemporary technology working through replacement, making everything replaceable. You seem to appreciate old style, mechanical, analog, modern technology. Does Heidegger's distinction hold for you? Here's another binary, or at least distinction, thrown at you. Have at it.
Oh, hi, Andrew. And Andrew is like one of the world experts on Heidegger, and I wouldn't even dare proffer an answer to that question. What was the question again? Like the difference between analog and...
Yeah, I mean, epochs in the history of technology, one that is analog to do with the object, the other to do with mediation, the standing reserve, the world picture. And this is my gloss. Does that distinction still operate for you?
Probably not. I mean, I wouldn't see the digital as like categorically different from the analog. I mean, I know it presents itself as that. The internet is framed as this immaterial thing, but there are still giant servers, standing reserves in the deserts of wherever it is, Nevada or Uzbekistan. And even when you seamlessly buy something online, there is some Indian 10-year-old boy whose body is laboring in a sweatshop to make that object. So it is totally material. It just is the trick of hiding its own materiality.
That's the beauty of the set piece with which you began, just the sheer production of this data in the wave take. I think we have time for just one more, and it's from
Technician is a writer, of course. He's got his laptop and he's pressing the space bar.
But he's still in the object world that's messy, as you put it. Okay, a final question from an anonymous attendee, but I bet you and I can figure out who this is. What is or was the state of the International Necronautical Society? Maybe you should explain INS a little bit.
Sure. I wonder if Simon Critchley is on the line here. He could just lurking.
Name names.
It's whatever. It's a fiction that sometimes, but everything's a fiction. It happens sometimes. It goes to sleep like a computer into sleep mode. At other times, it's been a bit sleepy recently. I think the committees are probably spending quite a lot of thought to work out how to reconfigure our thinking around the notion of democracy, because lots of the early manifestos came out in a time of neoliberal democracy, which we use quite often as a kind of straw man to attack. And now that that's very rapidly flipping over into something more akin to fascism, then maybe democracy needs to be saved from the bad press we were giving it somehow. So I don't know, watch the space, but don't hold your breath.
I think one of your statements of INS, or statement from the committee says that it's founded on the failure of transcendence. And it seemed to me that in this box 808, maybe it's a Pandora's box, there's a hint, not of transcendence, but of another place, another possibility. That, the infantile leftists of the young INS might disdain.
Yeah, there's a lovely quote that I read in Denis de Rougemont. I can't remember who it's from, but he says, I think it might be Kierkegaard. He says, there is another world, but it's this one. Or there is another world, but it's in this one. I love that. I love that idea.
It's like the Kafka line, there's hope, but not for us.
Yes. Agamben says the same. There is salvation, but not for us.
Right.
But the fallenness of things very failure to transcend hangs around them like a halo.
It's a beautiful way to end,
yeah.
I think. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for hosting this.
Yes, thank you both so much. This was a very fascinating conversation. I wish we could let it go all night, but I know it's very late in Berlin, so we should let you get to bed, Tom. Those of you at home, please do consider purchasing a copy of The Making of Incarnation from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Tom, congratulations on the book, and thank you both for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks.